back in the 90s, it was either this or this. You know, you have these, you know, those great Mario games or those Zelda titles. Or these, highly advanced graphics on Sony's PlayStation. They all have their downsides and upsides. So, I know when some of you were kids, you were always like, which one do I choose? In the 80s, Nintendo was dominating the video game market. And there was no sign of slowing down with their Famicom in Japan and the OG Nintendo in North America. But there was one problem. Cartridges cost too much to make, and they retail for too much. In a few cases, some cartridge games here in North America cost for $39. And a few cartridge games in Japan cost $30, even simple games. So, what did Nintendo come up with? They came up with the Famicom Disk System. It's an add-on for the Famicom that played games using floppy disks. Because they were around since the 70s and they became the standard form of media for most personal computers. They were cheap, they could hold more data than cartridges, and most importantly, they were rewritable. Now, Nintendo got this idea when a company called Hudson Soft, who was known for their Bomberman games, proposed an idea of a possible new add-on for their new system. It would play games using their patented beat cards, and they could also take it to a kiosk at a store and rewrite games to it. And that's exactly what Nintendo did with these floppy disks. And you can even rewrite games. Unfortunately, I don't know if this one is mine, because my RAM adapter to make this thing work is broken. All I really hope is for the best. But, yeah, they created the Famicom Disk System as a cheaper way to for playing casual games for less money. So that got developers to get even more creative with less stage-clear games, you know, like Wrecking Crew or Mario Brothers or Donkey Kong, and create games on a bigger scale. And to prove it, Nintendo launched the classic The Legend of Zelda. It was a massive adventure game that utilized all 128 kilobytes. His standard cartridges at the time were around 32 kilobytes, but with floppy disks, it created up to 128 kilobytes. And the discs were small. They were cheap because they were like $15 to $20, while the average cartridge game costs $30. And you'll notice there's no plastic shutter to protect the magnetic disc. Instead, they put every game in a wax sleeve in a plastic case, most likely to save money. And in some cases, there were even 2 games on each side. In fact, my copy of Mario Bros. 2 has ice hockey on side B. And hey, the cover even has a space to let you write in what game is on each side. And the problem with these things were, they had to introduce a whole new set of issues. For one thing, the discs are fragile. Without any protective plastic shutter to cover the magnetic disc, they can collect stuff like dust and fingerprints, which can eventually make them unplayable. And because games were now on discs, consumers had to get used to something new that we're now used to. And that would be loading times. Even this thing had reliability issues. Because one of the main things was the rubber drive belts that spin the discs, which would break over time. And many times people just boot up this thing to a random error number with no explanation. And what's bad about it is that all of the parts in this thing are proprietary, so getting replacement hardware is difficult. Overall, it's a very minimal add-on. And it has matching red colors to this thing. And you can even rewrite games. And you'll notice that every single one of the disc things has the word Nintendo into every disc. And when it may look like a branding strategy, it was actually an anti-piracy measure. And because if you look closely inside the disc slot, there's a stamp that fits with these letters when you put in the game. If it doesn't fit correctly, the game wouldn't play. Now the problem with that is that pirates could modify the Nintendo logo on the discs, and it avoided copyright issues. And they worked on these things, which allowed pirated games to be sold in stores. Heck, they were even advertised in magazines. And just a few months after this thing launched, Capcom released Ghosts and Goblins on a 128 kilobyte cartridge. Wow. It was the first of its kind. Plus, chip prices were coming down, so making cartridge-based games wasn't such an expense anymore. And if a company wanted a cartridge game converted to disc, they charged a hefty fee. Nintendo even claimed 50% copyright ownership of any disc system game, something cartridge-based games never had to worry about. There was also, not to mention, there was less money to be made in disc-based games. And while the kiosks at the retail stores were a cool and fun idea, they took up a lot of room in stores, and they had to be serviced regularly. So by '87, there were almost no advantages to having your game on a disc rather than a cartridge. And believe it or not, there were plans to release this thing in the United States. But by the time the patents were approved in '88, Nintendo canceled the plans. Not to mention, you could run this thing on C batteries, which was really cool because Nintendo thought that people's outlets would be hogged by the TV and the Famicom. And the RAM adapter was the key to operating this thing. It was responsible for sending all the data to the Famicom. Today, all that stuff is a collector's piece for video game enthusiasts such as myself. But it requires a little bit more attention because of the various hardware issues. Even buying software for the disc system can be tricky because games were overwritten constantly. Because, you may think you're purchasing Bubble Bobble, but once you pop it into the system, you find out it's something completely different. And you can buy one of these things with a new drive belt for $50 on eBay, but you're also going to need a Famicom. Or you could purchase the Sharp Twin Famicom. You don't know what that is? Let me give you a little insight. When this thing was released, Nintendo collaborated with Sharp and created the Sharp Twin Famicom. It was an all-in-one system that could play both Famicom games and Famicom Disk System games. But those go for a bit more, around $150. And I know what you're thinking, a Famicom is just totally out of the question since you'll have to import it. Well, these things do work using an NES top loader or an NES toaster model with a Famicom to NES card converter. But the problem is that the enhanced audio doesn't work using this method. If you don't know what that is, the enhanced audio, the floppy disks allow for detailed music and sound effects in games. If you want more information, check out FamicomDiskSystem.com. It's a pretty good resource. So, yeah, the disc and cartridge thing were crazy in the 80s. But if you think that was weird, you haven't seen anything yet. Now, throughout the late 90s, you had a lot of choices to choose from. You had, of course, the Sega Genesis, the Atari Jaguar, the Super Nintendo, the Nintendo, the 3DO, all that stuff. Not to mention a lot of Sega's consoles. 3 base models of the Genesis, the Sega CD, the Sega 32X, the Sega Nomad, the Sega Game Gear, not to mention the Sega CDX. But in 1994, Sony released their PlayStation. And it quickly picked up. The games were on discs, which gave them a lot of options when compared to making games with cartridges. For one thing, they're cheaper to make. They only cost like $7 or something. And thanks to CD, it created them to create almost movie-like quality and graphics. Not to mention, there were many great games on the PS1. You got Metal Gear Solid, Final Fantasy VII, Twisted Metal, Resident Evil, Spyro the Dragon, Crash Bandicoot, Tomb Raider, Castlevania Symphony of the Night, Silent Hill, Parappa the Rapper. All those great titles were on the PS1, including Resident Evil 2, which is one of my favorites. Nintendo, on the other hand, stuck with cartridges with their new Nintendo 64. You had 2 choices when it came to those two. If you wanted... The gamers saw it like this. If you wanted more, mature, teen-rated games and adults, you went with Sony's PlayStation. More of a family-friendly experience, you went with the Nintendo 64. But that didn't really please Sony. They didn't just want, just one half of the gaming audience. They wanted everybody to join in. So they started making more family-friendly titles, like Crash Bandicoot or Spyro the Dragon. Nintendo had a lot of issues with the 64, mostly due to the fact of the game still being on cartridges. And while this did make load times much faster than an OG PlayStation disc, it didn't really have the technical advantages. So how did Nintendo respond? Well, in Japan, they released the Nintendo 64 DD, aka the Nintendo 64 disc drive. It was a disc drive add-on that plugged into the base port on the bottom of the Nintendo 64 and allowed them to play floppy disks, similar to the Famicom disk system. Now, the reason this thing failed was for a variety of issues. They announced this thing somewhere in like 1997 or something, and it didn't come out until 1999, and at that point, the video game audience was moving on, to the other higher stuff like the PS2 and the Xbox. Not to mention, it wasn't released the traditional way. You could only get this thing through a mail subscription to RandNet. Now, that doesn't mean there weren't games released for it. There definitely were. But before we get to that, it had a lot of features. You could access Gmail, chat, access the internet. It even came with a keyboard and mouse. And its games, it had a kind of a short library. The only two I can remember is the Mario Paint games. There's Polygon Studio, Art Studio, something else, Creativity Studio, and another one. They were just like supposed to be sequels to Mario Paint on the Super Nintendo. And Doshin the Giant is the most unique one. You play as Doshin, some sort of god helping island villagers. And it was really released as a GameCube title in Europe. So, yeah. And that, unfortunately, it didn't last that long, and the RandNet online service was shut down in February of 2001. It was, however, a step in the right direction to bringing the world of gaming online. And then Nintendo would go on to release the GameCube. It would compete with the PS2 and the Xbox. And it had discs too. But when you opened up the discs, what I'm saying is like they were pretty small. And that was because Nintendo went for a proprietary format that was similar to mini DVDs. And while this did carve away illegal copiers, this didn't really fix much, because the discs had less storage than a regular disc. And this also meant that the GameCube couldn't play DVDs or CDs. But a few months after the GameCube's launch, a company called Panasonic offered a solution, the Panasonic Q, which I do not have. But it was basically a GameCube that can play, GameCube games and DVDs. And hey, you could even play video CDs if you have any of those laying around. But the Panasonic Q did a lot more than that. You had all of these cool options like surround, which was pretty impressive at the time. And it's pretty beautiful. Because I hear the front panel, it has a mirror, and the system is enclosed in a stainless steel frame. And it sits on 4 little legs like a couch or a chair or something. And the reason this thing failed was for issues. For one thing, it was cheaper to buy a GameCube and a DVD separately than to buy a Panasonic Q. And most accessories worked fine with it. And one that didn't, however, was Nintendo's popular Game Boy player. Heck, Panasonic even released their own version of the device to accommodate for the Q's design. But the price point just totally killed it. And they're kind of hard to find these days. They're usually going around for $250 to $600, depending on their condition. Not to mention, the GameCube wasn't doing that well between Microsoft's Xbox and Sony's PS2. The PS2 came in first place, and the GameCube came in third place behind Microsoft's Xbox. Sega even had their own disc-based systems. At first there was the Sega Saturn, and then the Sega Dreamcast, which was an updated version of the Sega Saturn, I hear. And the Sega Dreamcast is considered one of Sega's greatest game systems. But the discs, they were really, really open to pirating. And that was a real issue in the video game industry at that point. Nowadays, Sega doesn't really do that much with consoles, but they have released the Sega Genesis Mini. Now, if you want to say stuff like, What are the pros and cons of discs and cartridges? We'll get to that later. Now, what are the advantages and disadvantages of cartridges and discs? Well, let's first start off with the OG. Back in the day, cartridges were basically the only option you had if you wanted to play games unless you had an expensive computer. So, again, they came up with the Famicom disc system. Advantages, standard cartridges were about 32 kilobytes, and this thing could go up to 128 kilobytes. And there's a special processor inside the RAM adapter that provides an additional audio channel, and this allows for detailed music and sound effects in games. And you could even rewrite games to your discs. You could even buy a blank disc for about $12 in Japan and write a new game to it. And while the upfront cost of this thing was somewhat high, buying games for the system was relatively cheap. An average disc system game was around like $15 to $20, while the average cartridge game costs $30 to $40. And it doesn't need an AC adapter. It can run on 6C batteries. And I hear this thing lasts quite a while on batteries. But with all that being said, this thing does have its problems, as I mentioned earlier in the video. Because I know most people at that point were used to simply putting in a cartridge and playing that game. Using this format introduced a whole new set of issues. The discs, they can break really easily, and they can collect dust and fingerprints, which can eventually make them unplayable. And they had to get used to a new concept that we of course are now used to. Loading times. I mean, this thing had reliability issues too. Most notably the rubber drive belts that spin the discs. They're really flimsy and they can just break over time. Not to mention, all of the parts are proprietary, so getting replacement hardware is difficult. But overall, it's a pretty neat add-on, and it had tons of potential, but it kind of fell short, kind of like the Wii U. And just 4 months after the disc system launched, Capcom released Ghosts and Goblins on a 128 kilobyte cartridge, and chip prices were coming down, so making cartridge games wasn't such an expense anymore. And there was all this stuff about 50% copyright ownership of any disc system game. Not to mention there was less money to be made in disc system games. So they went back to making cartridges. But then, Sony came along and created the PlayStation and all of its cool games. Now, there was a few problems. For one thing, the discs required a memory card to save your games. If you didn't have one, it wouldn't save. It even notified you that in the console. Cartridges, on the other hand, had their own save features. But, I don't know how to explain this, but the technical advantages of these things were not so great. But, again, you had those highly advanced graphics and these as I was saying, pros and cons of a cartridge and a disc. Let's start with discs. Discs, highly advanced graphics, great games, full motion video. Cons, if they get scratched, they're done, unless you get them professionally resurfaced. The older models required a memory card, and if they break, they're done. Cartridge advantages. They're not that fragile. They came with their own save state, and they had all those great, Mario titles and Zelda titles and all that stuff. Cons, the graphics aren't so great. Oh, which reminds me, the CD load times on these things were kind of long. The cartridges load times were much faster, but the cartridges didn't have that good graphics. Now, by today's standards, we have, stuff like the Xbox One, the PS4, and the Nintendo Switch. The Nintendo Switch uses tiny, tiny cartridges, and the PS4 uses discs, and so does the Xbox One. Now, of course, the PS4 is, you know, a little more realistic than Nintendo Switch games. But some games, like Zelda Breath of the Wild, were pretty. They were beautiful. You know, they had all these crazy, like, glowing special effects. So, the big question: which is better, cartridges or discs? Honestly, I can't answer that. They kind of both weigh a little bit even on the seesaw. You know, the discs have their own advantages, the cartridges have their own advantages. You know, the cartridges have, like, all those great Mario titles, those Zelda titles, all that stuff. The GameCube came along and included these proprietary small discs that were similar to mini DVDs. Now, discs on stuff like the PS2 and the Xbox, they had, like, great graphics. They could have, like, full motion video and all that stuff. But the problem with them is that they were fragile. And over time, they can collect stuff like scratches and fingerprints. If they work with scratches and fingerprints, I pretty much live with it. But if it's causing problems, I would suggest you get them resurfaced professionally. And some stores like Vintage Stock will resurface them for you for a small fee. So, you know, discs and cartridges each have their own advantages and disadvantages. But honestly, I don't think it matters. I think what really matters is that you just have fun with it. I mean, it's just a game. So, how about does it for cartridges versus discs?